Great, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So we're here today to talk about API design and treating APIs as products. We're going to run through a little bit of the framework that we use and the process, but we really want to deep dive into some real examples where we'll go through some of the challenges we faced and how we've solved them. So hopefully we'll be decent. So I'm Ryan Clifford, API product lead for our EMEA developer portal, fiserv.dev.
And hi everybody, I'm Ross Bennis. I'm the API product owner for the same portal. So to kick off, just a little bit about Fiserv. So we're one of the largest merchant acquirers globally, enabling payment processing for in-store and online payments. We serve nearly 6 million merchants, about 10,000 financial institutions, and we process over 12,000 transactions per second. So what does that actually mean? So if we bring that back into a day-to-day scenario, if you're in a coffee shop and you're getting yourself a coffee and you click or you put your card over the terminal and you see the processing wheel, that's one scenario. And the other one is if you're paying online, if you're online and you go and you click the pay button, you also see the processing wheel. You've very likely used our products. We're looking after the payment process there on behalf of yourself and our merchants.
So when we went about building out our developer platform, we obviously really wanted to focus on the actual APIs, which are the products that you go to the platform for. So we built out a framework which kind of touches these areas of design, building, launching, and lifecycle management of APIs. For today, we're just going to focus on that design section. And when it comes to that design section, we put in a bit of a design process, which is some guidelines that we follow kind of step by step whenever we are looking at designing a new API. So the first bunch, and I won't go through every single one in detail, I just want to give it as a high level. The first 10 that you see on here are things that we do when we consider designing the API. And then it moves into the next phase, which is all about validating that API design with clients to get feedback before anything is ever developed, and then incorporating that feedback from clients. And then the last stage is all about reviewing it and approving it. So you've got reviewing it with our team as a peer review, and then it's either approved or needs some rework, and then we want to get an open API spec onto our dev portal as quickly as possible, even when it's in design stage. So then we'll tell consumers that this is in development. If you're interested, please engage with us so they can get early access. And we can also incorporate feedback before the final product is actually developed. So out of this kind of high level 15 steps here, my favorite one is number 13, which is our API design review. And that's essentially where an API product manager will bring the design, like Ross, to the team and will peer review it. Sometimes these sessions are referred to as roasting sessions, because we are very honest with our feedback, but it's all done in a very good way. I have been accused of maybe throwing some people under the bus during that session, but I would like to acknowledge that just like Regina George, if you get this Mean Girls reference, they all do survive. And they do say thank you sometimes. No. So, after our design process, one of the features on here was our guidelines and standards. So we built out a number of different guidelines, standards, examples, documentation, which broadly cover these areas. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to go through each of these in detail, but essentially behind each of these kind of boxes, there's documentation, examples, guidance around what you should be thinking about and the questions you should be asking when considering what response code should come back, what do you want the consumer to do. So there's lots of different information that we kind of have built up over time. This is a living and breathing kind of document that we've built to kind of help API product managers in our team, but also across the rest of our internal teams, even when designing internal APIs, because they're just as important as external APIs. So we're going to jump in now to 3 examples where we've actually been applying these standards and guidelines.
So the first example is our disputes API. So a dispute, which is also called a chargeback, is when a cardholder wants to query a transaction that they see on their statement. So cardholder gets their statement, they see a transaction, they're going, that's fraudulent. So they contact their bank. The bank then would raise a dispute on their behalf, and then that would reach the merchant. So at this point, the merchant has two options. They can either accept and say the dispute is fraudulent, or they can go into the next thing where they can challenge the dispute. So as you can see, that comes into this lovely little process here. So the challenge that we face is for the card schemes, so your Visas, your MasterCards, JCB, for example, they have different processes when defending a dispute. And in the various stages of that dispute, they request different information. So with disputes, it's really, really complicated.
So what's really interesting, when we were faced at solving for this solution, you can see here, this is a real screenshot of one of the boards we used when thinking about the design, and there's a lot of logic. And if you go, and I would challenge you, if you go onto the market and look for a disputes API, a lot of this logic is left to the consumer to figure out. We didn't want to do that. We wanted to look at how do we incorporate the logic into the solution. So here's just a snippet of one of our GET requests on a dispute. And what we ended up doing, it took a while to get to this, is we decided that what we actually want to return is an allowed actions array. And in that array, we're going to say, okay, you've got a dispute that's come in. You can do 3 different actions, but for those 3 different actions, there are... Oh, someone's interested in this from another room. So, depending what action you want to do, there's different fields that need to be required. So we thought, okay, let's think about what the consumer's trying to do here. They want to access this API to build some form of UI for their client to use. Currently, people in the market will say, well, you deal with which fields you need to provide onto the screen. Where we went, well, let's think they're trying to build a UI. So if we were to actually return, here are the required data fields that you need to provide, but we provide everything you need to essentially drive your UI. So you've got the name of the field, you've got everything around what format it should accept, the min, max. You've also got a description, which you could even show your consumer on your UI. You could say this is the description, but we've got a notes section, which could be just notes for you as the API consumer. So essentially what you can do now is you can programmatically design your UI and pull all of the information about what data fields are needed just by using the the API. You don't have to even think about the logic. We're essentially telling you that. But what was interesting when coming up with this solution, as much as that's really helpful, you still want to understand the overall kind of concept of what am I doing with disputes? What are all of the different types of actions that I can possibly do? So that's where we really went through, documentation is a key part of actually providing all of the context that someone needs to know. So I guess with this disputes API, a key takeaway from it was that documentation is key to a good developer experience, along with what I would say world-leading design of a disputes API, but you can challenge me later on if you want. So second example.
So our second example is transactional data. So transactional data is made up of 3 APIs. So the authorizations, if I go back to tapping a card, so your payment is being verified, you would have seen this when you get that authorization code after that processing will eventually stops. And then there's the second stage, which is clearing, where is our second API, which is transactions API. So that indicates when the money is being ready to be moved. And once that's cleared, then is the last phase is the settlement, which is the funding API. And that's when the money is eventually moved from the cardholder over to the merchant. So the challenge that we faced on this one is actually these 3 APIs and their endpoints are related. So we had to figure out a way during reconciliation to show how they're linked. So in this diagram here in our documentation, it's attempting to do exactly that. It's beginning to show the relationships between the APIs and their endpoints. And we found out with transactional data just in real life that relationships are actually hard.
So the solution here that we wanted to tackle with is showing just documentation worked really good in previous circumstances, but how could we make the API design better? So this was the first snippet of what we would return on a GET, for example. So did have everything you needed to find out what is the funding order that's connected to this transaction, but you essentially had to look through these fields and go, there's an order ID. That's the order ID I now need to use on another endpoint. That's not really a great user experience that you have to go through these fields. So instead, taking some inspiration from kind of the Hatios concept, we went, how do we start to add links into it? So if you're interacting with, so this one is a snippet from our Transactions API, you can see, okay, here's the authorization, and here's the funding endpoint that you need to interact with. So again, you now can programmatically kind of work through how do I reconciliate all of my payments all the way from authorizations to transactions to funding. And the key takeaway here was we could actually replace documentation by doing good API design. And essentially, we were using documentation as a bit of a crutch for our API design until we realized. And then we went, let's change this. Let's make a really good API design by just incrementing it, adding a new feature. So that was a great lesson learned. And I think a big part of that came from we were managing transactional data as a product. So it wasn't, let's just release this data and our customers are fine because they had the data. We were constantly and still are going, how do we improve these endpoints? So our third example that we're going to go through.
So that's our Checkouts API. So again, back to the online shopping experience, you click pay. You may notice that every now and then you might get a little refresh page that doesn't quite look like the site that you're buying your goods or services off. That's actually where our Checkouts API kicks in. What that does is it redirects you to a Fiserv-owned hosted payment page. We process the payment on the merchant's behalf, and then we send you right back to the merchant's website. So we look after that payment on behalf of the merchant, the website owner. So the challenge that we faced here, we've built a really good design. It's matching the standards that Ryan went through earlier. We have an intuitive request body. We have a really simple response body. And even our documentation backs it up well. It takes you through the whole checkouts flow, explaining the whole end-to-end process. But the challenge that we are facing is that still doesn't really give the full story about our Checkouts API. How do we visualize this? So we've built a great API design, we've supported it with documentation, but we're not really giving the developer the full developer experience.
So that's where the solution meant a real demo. So I'm going to do a real demo and hope it works. So this is actually an exclusive because we've not actually put any of this officially live, but it is sort of live. So I do like to go rogue. So on our developer portal, if we think about the current experience we were talking about when we would talk to consumers, is we would say, look, you can go to our dev portal, you can go to our documentation, you can go into our API reference, have a look at our checkout solution. You can see the post here. You could actually interact, throw in an API key. You could try out a request example and then get a response. But that's only part of the story. So instead, we decided we're going to build out a demo site. So essentially, it's like a reference client where we can show, and by the way, I'm literally going to show you exactly what someone can do here. You don't need to even get an API key. I can come to this demo suite. I can go into, we have a couple different things here, but I'll go to checkouts first. I'll go to the shop here. So here's a completely fictitious shop called Brush and Bean, where you could buy a few items. So you could add these to your checkout basket, which is what someone would actually do. You would add these, and then you'd want to go and pay. Now this is where what's going to happen is it's going to start to interact with our Checkouts API. So I can go click on checkout. Now this, I'm going to populate some of the details. Let me populate this. So standard things like your address. And I'm going to click pay. So what's that's doing now? That's sending a request to our Checkouts API. And it's getting a response back, which is a checkout page like this. Now, we actually have a UI which you can log into our dev portal and configure the look and feel of this. And now what you can do is you can enter, I've got a test card here. Let me just pop this in, a security code. Let me put a name. Here we go. And I can click pay now. And if this works, it should be successful and take you back to what is a success page if it works. But as I said, it's a live demo. But the idea of this is that in any conversation with a client, they can do this themselves, and they don't need to, as I've just shown you, I didn't have to log in to get an API key if they just want to test. This should hopefully work. It's taking some time, but that could be the Wi-Fi.
I think everyone's thinking you have insufficient funds there. Right?
Huh? Insufficient funds. It could be. Why that is doing its it couldn't be done. Let's see what that was. Let's see if second time lucky works. I will say it did work just before. Why that's doing that, I might also just show. On our demo suite, we also wanted to look at our transactional data APIs, because essentially what you're getting back there is a bunch of data, but what do you do with it? And that's where we started to mock out what a dashboard could look like. So all of this is pulling from our authorizations API, this is our funding API, this is our transactions API, and this is our statements API. So all of this is interacting with the sandbox, which someone else can use as well. So I don't know why this payment is not going through. It may be because I've entered something wrong, but maybe that could work. Who knows? Let me re-enter, because I really want to get this to work so you see the success page. Otherwise,
on my card.
So this is where we need a volunteer from the audience who has a card, who has sufficient funds. But what's actually good, here we go, it was successful. Great, thank you very much. So that is just a quick way that we wanted to demo the API, because there's more of an experience that goes behind it. So essentially, if this loads back up, here we go. Good API design documentation paints the picture, but a demo brings it to life.
So then if we were to go to the takeaways, so our framework provides the guide to designing our consistent APIs throughout our developer portal and Fiserv. Some APIs, they do speak for themselves. Other APIs, they need that little bit of assistance they need that other voice. And then some APIs, they just need a good demo.
Or Ross's favourite meme from his favourite film. So essentially, and I'm quite excited to say this, as of yesterday, this is, and it's a shameless plug for me, this is how you build an award-winning developer platform, which was announced just yesterday, Best API Reference Documentation. Thank you very much. It's a big win for the team because they put in a lot of effort into designing APIs, and it shows with the kind of documentation and everything we've kind of focused on when it comes to developer experience. So I want to say thank you and ask if you have any questions, please. I'm happy for any hard questions.
Anybody has a question? Maybe I have one for you. During the design phase, I see you're using quite some advanced new ways of designing APIs. So some bits are technical, some bits are really product design. In which kind of sessions do you come up with those ideas that the tech is feeding the product to make new design ideas?
It's kind of been there's a couple different aspects to this, I think. I think having the right people who are technically minded but also business savvy is a really hard skill set to find. Like I've done many interviews with API product managers. We're talking probably about 400 candidates over the last 2 years, and I found a handful. But when you find them, they're great. I think then it's around having the right mindset and the right core principles of how do I treat this as a product. And then we really just share a lot of knowledge. Like we are constantly sharing ideas that we find inspiration from other platforms, from books, from blogs, and then just having review sessions. We have an incredible culture where you can be quite open and honest. And when I say roasting sessions, like I'm not joking, they are roasting sessions, but they're all done with good fun.
Thank you.
Scary though.
Oh, there's a question just there if we can quickly take it.
So Markkanina and I was talking about a very similar method, API cycles open method yesterday, and it was interesting to compare. But I was making the point that the roasting sessions are bad for business, so to speak, because if you don't have a proper phased out checklist of when you should have certain things in the design. So my question is, how do you deal with, in your method, with two things. First, the kind of the knowledge level, the maturity level of the team and the developers and designers, and then the life cycle of the API. So do you do like a design review only when it's kind of about to go to production, or very early, and are they different?
So I'll tackle that last bit because that's just in my head first of all. So originally, we get an API product manager who'd work on a design, and once they had sort of felt comfortable with it, they would then do a design review with the team. By the way, this was all before any development happened. Then it would go into development, and then there's production, and then there's continuous checks. Then what we realized is that some API product managers wanted to come to the team quite early on when they were still thinking through stuff to validate some of the structural side of the API design. So they brought design sessions earlier. One thing that we did end up implementing was quality check reviews, even once it's gone into production, constantly doing checks, and we found a number of different things to enhance the experience afterwards. And then I think the former questions around, was it maturity
of the team and the developers and designers?
I think what's been really interesting is we are all learning together. And when we learn new things or we implemented a new design, we've shared it with the team. So now we've got a bunch of different examples. So when we come to designing a new API, we can go, okay, how have we done something like this before elsewhere? And how can we take inspiration from it? Because you're not going to have one API designer who designs every API. So sharing knowledge in those sessions is so important. So everyone has a bit of an awareness of the different products, and we can call out improvements. But we're still maturing.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, so congratulations on your Dev Portal Award. I had a question about the portal. Did you build that from scratch? Was there any particular frameworks or platforms that you used as a starting point for the portal? And how much customization as well did you do over time to it?
It's been quite an interesting one when it comes to the whole developer platform. And I say developer platform very specifically because you've got the dev portal, which is that shop front and the experience, and then the APIs, which are the products that sit in that shop. It's evolved over time, so we've had kind of different components. Some are in-house built tools, especially the logged in experience, because it's very specific stuff. Some are using tools externally. So we've used a mixture of documentation tools. At one point we used Stoplight as a tool, which was great for API design, does have some documentation. But then we also then moved to kind of README because it has richer documentation. And then on the kind of, we have like the CMS side where it's your logged out experience, your marketing pages. So it's kind of evolved over times, and we've used a tool to get us like a solution, and then we've looked at reviewing it and saying, is that the right tool? For documentation, it actually did change. And I already know what the third iteration of our documentation looks like, which will be a more in-house built tool. Last question?
Yeah, question about the data model side of things.
Yeah.
You show these API designs. How do you link them to the data models that I'm sure you have? Is that a manual process, or do you have some automated tooling to make sure that the API structures and the data structures are in sync?
So there was actually a talk that happened at API Days London which touched on data a little bit more specifically, which you could probably see as a recording. But one thing we had to build out was canonical data models. So as we're designing APIs, there's a bunch of data models that we need to be consistent as we're talking about these APIs. Because essentially underlying, you've got many, many teams building payments, data, authorizations, etc. So what we had to do as a whole organization, build out canonical data models so that when everyone's designing an API, they go, do we have an existing object or model or common examples, common field names that we can leverage? And in design tools like Stoplight, there are things that you can do where you can pull from shared models. And that's how we've kind of tackled it to begin with.
So you've got traceability from the data models into all the APIs that use those entities, let's just call them that.
Yeah, so there's a way you can look at it and you can see how it's networked. So you can see, okay, these are the APIs that are using this shared model. And you can do it the other way to say what models is this API using. Cool. Thank you very much for the questions. I thought I'd get roasted a bit more, but...